Hello and welcome to the second session of the 2021 Meg Quigley Summer Series. I'm Stephanie Patterson, the Education Coordinator for the Meg Quigley Vivaldi Competition and Bassoon Symposium. This event will be in English, but live Spanish interpretation is provided. You will see an interpretation button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Simply select your preferred language to hear an audio translation of the event. I'd like to introduce our translator, Carlos Lopez.
Hola, buenas tardes. Este evento será en inglés, pero habrá interpretación simultánea a español. Simplemente busquen el botón de interpretación abajo de su pantalla y seleccionen el idioma de su preferencia.
Thank you, Carlos. I think that many of you were with us for last summer's session, but if you missed any or would like to watch them again, recordings are available on our website, megquigley.org. Also, be sure to follow Meg Quigley on social media for announcements of future weekly summer series events. Our goal is to feature a diverse array of voices, and for these sessions to serve bassoon students, avocational players, and professionals alike. If you would like to support our continued efforts in these areas and beyond, visit megquigley.org/donate to become a friend of Meg Quigley Vivaldi Competition and Symposium. The first repertoire session, which is this one, will feature two acts. Up first is a conversation between composer Jenni Brandon and Jacqueline Wilson, assistant professor of bassoon at Washington State University, focused on Brandon's Colored Stones for Solo Bassoon, which was featured in the Meg Quigley Competition Repertoire 2016. Act 2 will feature a conversation with Garrett McQueen, executive director and host of the podcast Triloquy, and Titus Underwood, principal oboe of the Nashville Symphony, who will discuss William Grant Still's 3 songs arranged for bassoon and other woodwinds by Alexa Still. Continuing Meg Quigley's mission of inclusivity, education, and outreach, this session is meant to support teachers and students as college audition lists are expanded to include works by historically marginalized composers. As you enjoy today's sessions, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A feature. Afterward, we invite you to join us for a happy hour Zoom meeting to reflect on today's session, play a few games, and enjoy each other's company. The information for that Zoom meeting can be found at megquigley.org/happyhour, and it will be sent in the chat immediately following this event. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our guests for the first half, Jenni Brandon and Jackie Wilson.
Hi, Stephanie. Hello.
Hi, and welcome. So I think we're going to start off by asking some questions of Jenni about the composition of this piece, and then Jackie's going to talk to us about the pedagogy of teaching it and performing it. So my first question for Jenni is, why did you decide to write this piece for bassoon?
So I decided to write this piece for bassoon. It was for the competition, for the Bassoon Chamber Music Composition Competition. And I had gotten an email actually at one point from Kristen Jensen about the competition. And I was like, oh, this sounds like a fun opportunity. And so I had been wanting to write a solo bassoon piece. I'd written other solo instrument pieces up to this point, and I'd been writing for bassoon in trios and duets and things like that up to this point. But I thought, wow, I really need to have a piece for the solo bassoon. And I thought, even if I don't win the competition, that's fine. I'll still have a piece for solo bassoon. So I decided to go ahead and write it, and I worked with Kristen Webb, who's a wonderful friend of mine here in the LA area, as I was writing this piece. And then so that was how this piece came about. Was actually written for the competition specifically.
And you won. And it was recorded. Yeah, and that's awesome. And then because you won, we used it in the semifinal round of the 2016 Meg Quigley competition, which so that's fantastic. Now, when you were writing the piece, did anything about the bassoon really surprise you or inspire you? Or
I think the bassoon at the time to me still felt very new, like learning the instrument. And, I'd been working with a group in LA, working with, how to write for the instrument and to get better and better at it. And so with writing this piece, anytime a composer writes a solo piece, it's very naked. It's like the instrument and nothing else supporting it. So
it's I think that when I play it too.
Exactly. Very naked. And it's just very open. It's like, what do you do to make it interesting and exciting? And I think for me, for writing for the bassoon, I think especially at this point, it was kind of learning to expand into the different registers of the instrument, and also not being afraid to go into the upper register. That had been sort of a thing, I think, emerging composers sometimes, maybe not everybody, but they're like, ooh, I heard, this is scary, and I don't know if I want to write up here if I don't know how to write for the instrument. Well, so I felt like I was able to really dip my toe into exploring the registers of the bassoon, specifically in this piece.
Yeah, and I know we're going to get into that with the pedagogy, because you definitely do explore the high register of the bassoon in this piece.
Yep.
My other question about the sort of the composition is it's based on 3 stones that you picked, and you talk about this briefly in the introductory like preface to the piece. But I'm just curious, why did you pick these stones?
So I'm a little bit obsessed with stones. Everywhere I go, I pick them up. My house is full of stones. You can't see, but there's a pile of stones behind me. There's stones outside. There's stones everywhere. So I love stones, and I love, tumbled stones, rough stones, everything. And I'd been curious about what stones meant in different cultures and to different people. Like some people, it's very spiritual with the stones. Some people, it's culturally, it means different things. And so I started to want to explore that. And so I had this book, and I have show and tell here today too, called The Crystal Bible. And this book is great because it is full of not only like, if you want to, believe in like, well, this stone can help you speak better, or it can help you be more confident, or it can get rid of, bad feelings, whatever. It explains all that. It also explains where all the stones come from in this book. And I just think they're so beautiful. And so I was looking for 3 different stones to choose for this. And I have a couple of them here with me today. I've got the lapis lazuli here. I know it's very hard to see. I'll kind of hold it back so it doesn't get all like out of focus. I've got the tiger's eye here as well. And then actually my smoky quartz is in a piece of jewelry, in a ring that I have. But I wanted to explore, and I feel like I could expand this piece into like 18 more movements of all of my favorite stones. So yeah, I wanted to pick stones that had different meanings and different colors that would make it a really interesting story to tell in this piece.
Yeah. Let's. People are saying they want more movements in the chat. Just so you know, there's interest.
Well, I've been thinking about that. So there we go, guys. Send me your favorite colored stones, and we'll start talking about next movements for this piece.
Yes. Okay. You're on. I have a feeling you're about to get some emails from bassoonists.
I might. I'll look forward to it.
Okay, well, great. And we're going to have you talk about some specific sections in just a minute. But I want to ask Jackie, why did you choose this piece when you first, learned it and programmed it?
Well, I was familiar with Jenni's works, especially her chamber music, and so I was excited to explore her composition for the bassoon as a solo voice. I really liked the idea of the movements with the stones as a point of departure, kind of like a character piece. So not programmatic, but a suggestion of a vibe that was really attractive to me. When I first programmed it, it was in the context of a recital that was otherwise bassoon and piano. And even though the pieces were all very different, the homogeneity of the texture, I just really wanted some contrast. And I needed, that we kind of have like 15 to 20-minute pieces, 8 to 10-minute pieces, and like 3 to 5-minute pieces. And I needed something in that like 8-minute category. But the prospect of playing like 8 unaccompanied minutes, it's like it can be a lot. And so the idea that this was structured into 3 movements, that was pretty much a guaranteed break, also guaranteed contrast and shift in character to maintain interest. Something like, say, the Osborne Rhapsody is very standard, but that's kind of a harder big picture to make. And I liked the idea of this being unified, but also sectionalized. And yeah, I paired it with choreography at the time. And so it was just like a really exciting addition to my repertoire, but also in learning those 3 different movements. We always have those situations like a school visit or something where you need to pull something out of your hat really quick, and that needs to be in like the 3 to 5-minute category. And so getting the big payoff of the piece, but also being able to have it in my repertoire to use when and where needed, I was like, yes, I'm playing this.
Wonderful. I love the idea of the character piece. Jenny, when you were mentioning the colors, it brought me back to the very first Meg Quigley competition where actually there was the piece Dreaming in Colors by Hai Kyung Lee where every movement was a different color.
Oh yeah.
There's something about the bassoon is so evocative of that visual color. But I'm not going to yammer on about that. So let's get into it. I know we can play some excerpts and we can look at the score and talk about the pedagogy of it. But Jackie, would you like to tell us like how do you start teaching this piece to a student? And Jenny, if you have ideas or from listening to so many people play it, please jump in.
Sure.
Yeah, so we're kind of framing this. I think this piece works for a lot of levels, including professional, but kind of framing it in that advanced high schooler undergraduate level. I think this is a really great piece for a younger player who's either inexperienced or completely new to unaccompanied playing. I think it can take the place or serve the function of those pieces like Osborne Rhapsody, Arnold Fantasy, that type of thing. And I actually like to teach this backwards, especially for a less experienced student. I like to start them on the third movement and then move to the second and move to the first. And we can talk a little bit more in detail about why I choose that. But more generally, things I think the piece offers. Different movements have different levels of intensity at any given concept, but it does introduce some really important things like no key signature, but functioning on accidentals. Different movements have different levels of proportion of shifting between clefs. The register and the range, though it does explore the register, different movements parse that out to different degrees. And though it has a highly expressive, kind of flexible feeling, I feel again like that's dispersed kind of differently and accomplished in different ways throughout the movement. And it still gives the student something to grab onto. It's very tuneful. You can hear points of return, different themes or motives contrasting with one another. So they still have things they can apply from the work that they have been doing, but this just kind of stretches their muscles and pushes them in new ways that I think are really effective for the students of that age.
Wonderful. So if we're going to start at the third movement, maybe we can take a look at the score. And Jenny, can you tell, you wanted to say something, and I just have to say, this is my favorite part of the whole piece, is the beginning of the third movement.
Oh, good.
But go ahead and tell us, what were you thinking about here? What inspired you here?
So, I think about bassoon writing, and sometimes I know that bassoonists will end up playing, the bass line, and there's a lot of bump, 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 bump. So I wasn't trying to be too stereotypical here. However, the bassoon just does it so well and does this sound so well. And what I was thinking of, especially with the story of Tiger's Eye, the idea that it's like this, like protective from the evil eye, sort of, I wanted to create this sort of, space where the bassoon is sort of almost weaving this circle of protection, to kind of go along with the story. So as that grows, right, it grows further and further apart. So we expand our protection wheel around us in larger and larger intervals. So, and I had a lot of fun writing the opening of this too, just kind of giving it this sort of like almost kind of creeping along and creeping back and creeping along and like, oh, you're not going to break through the circle. So that's kind of what I was playing with here in this opening section.
Yeah, I love the idea of the circles. I don't know, Jackie, would you like to listen to it before you talk or?
Yeah, let's listen to some of it.
Great.
So yeah, just kind of looking pedagogically at some of the things at play here, and I'll talk, this is kind of a representative passage, the opening, but talking kind of about the movement as a whole. There's kind of a discomfort or a vulnerability that comes with unaccompanied playing that for the student can be this new thing. And so going movements 3, 2, 1, they can inch their way into the deep end, they can start in the shallow end and move their way into more intense. So in the third movement, there's no tenor clef at all. It's entirely in the bass clef. So if they're still expanding their register, this really helps with that, tiptoe in approach. A flat above the staff is the highest pitch, so it also doesn't take them into anything too extreme. And we can see here there is a regular tempo, there's an experiential tempo, and there is tempo shifting, ritardandos, accelerandos, but they're all kind of in relation to experiencing a tempo. And so it's kind of like hitting the gas, hitting the brakes, and it's relating to that concept that's very familiar of them of a steady pulse. You can also shave a little bit off the tempo and it still works. So if they can't actually achieve quarter equals 120, or if they're still building toward that, I think that the movement is still really effective even at just this little bit slower tempo. And also with nerves, you could actually probably go a little bit faster and still have it work and not have the wheels fall off. I think there are really organic places to breathe, and the places to be patient and kind of musically finesse the phrases are really built in. So they're painting by numbers. I feel like there's still a lot of guidance in this movement that they still can feel secure while just kind of getting exposed to some of these things. No key signature, but accidentals is present, but not overwhelming here. And a lot of the accidentals we see are the familiar ones and that type of thing. So I really like this as something with a big payoff that is achievable and kind of sets the tone for taking it to more extremes as we work backwards through the piece.
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. I've had students look at movement 1 and see how high it goes and just say, I can't play that high, but I love the idea of starting with the third movement. Any other comments or questions on the third movement? Should we move to the second? Yeah. Great. So Jenni, you picked another section at the beginning of the second movement. Tell us about that.
I did. So I'm also a vocalist by nature, and so to me, this movement is very vocal. I really enjoy bringing into my works the ability for performers to interpret what they want to interpret in a section by sort of leaving space for them to do it. And so for me, like this beginning section of Lapis Lazuli is very much a vocal movement for me, with some push and pull, almost like, melismatic, kind of passages. And so that was the thing. And in a general statement about this work. And Jackie, I loved what you said about the third movement being like, put on the brakes, put on the gas. Like, you're right. That third movement is absolutely like pretty in tempo. Like we kind of go, versus this movement where there's a lot of like luxurious tempo changes that you can play with. So that's really the big thing for me in general for this piece. And then for my music in general, is I like to give performers a lot of space to interpret. So this is sort of, I feel like, quintessential of that for me.
Wonderful. Let's take a listen. Awesome.
Yeah.
I want to say something. Awesome. Bravo. Okay, now
Yeah, I hope everyone has the experience of listening to themselves play in front of a room full of other bassoonists with a camera in front of their face. But yeah, this is such a fun movement to play. And it is, as Jenny said, more free. And in terms of all the stuff I was talking about before, it really like ups the ante in all of those areas. So even just visually looking at it, you can see that the accidentals are a lot more saturated. There is tenor clef in this movement, but it's only 5 measures. So it's definitely something that they can, handle and get used to. And it goes from kind of more thematic to, and maybe Jenny can comment on this, but kind of more motivic. The shifting happens more frequently, and you have to be able to take smaller ideas that are unified or changed and developed over time and be able to make those connections for the audience. So that's just a little bit more of an advanced interpretation. But I think that the guidance that is written into the score by Jenny is really helpful. So even if the student is perhaps more conservative or less into taking chances, if they just follow what's written there, even if they're pretty much keeping everything in tempo and they're not pushing so much or pulling so much, it will work. It's kind of like it teaches them how to, here's where you go, here's where you pull, okay, and this fermata, now you go again, blah, blah, blah. And so it's almost like teaching them through the score of what ideas make sense and what is maybe a good thing to highlight, to set apart, to connect. You can see phrase markings in addition to articulation markings. So even the student who's like, okay, I get it's free, I get the character's different, but I don't really feel so comfortable, just like, is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? The score itself provides so much guidance that these things that are more intense, the tempo changes more frequently, the triplet eighth rhythms juxtapose more frequently, but the score really calls for the push and pull that is effective. And so I really like those guideposts to help them out in this. And yeah, it's just a good turning up of the intensity volume moving to this movement from the third.
And I love that, Jackie. And I'm just going to add a little bit to what you said on that about, there's a lot of shifts in this piece or in this movement. And I think a key to and a lot of the way that I write, and especially in this piece, is with these transitions from section to section. So like you were talking about like the fermatas and things like that, like those are places I think where a student can really dig in and explore a little more, maybe over the edge than they're used to, because they're important spots. And so how they interpret them is how they're going to set up that next section. So I love that students, well, anybody really, but like that was my intention, was to let those transitions be not just transitions, but really important moments to shape and color what comes next.
Yeah, wonderful. And I just say thank you for using words other than just like slow and fast, but like luxurious and deep. Like this is telling the student how to like imagine, like it's such a great guide. I just really appreciate that in your music.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's important. I love it. It's like, reading a poem. Like I feel like it's like poetry and just trying to use the notes and the words to kind of color everything. So I'm glad that comes across.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I think we do need to move to the first movement because we could talk about this for hours. But now you actually picked 2 different sections, so I'm wondering if let's see, maybe Jenny, if you could just speak about this movement and sort of I know you like to talk about the character changes, so I'm really curious. And Dave, you might have to switch the score down, a little bit, but I think you go ahead and say what section you want to.
Sure. I had been looking at starting around letter B, the playful section. And I love this section just because it's, get to really jump into that rhythmic movement that I think the bassoon is really good at, but kind of playing with rhythm and kind of playing with moving it up and down while also setting this tempo, but giving some freedom in this section as well, so that, unlike in the third movement where it's very like dun 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 kind of movement, we get to go fast and then we pull it back a little bit. And I had one thing I just wanted to say for everybody who's worked on this, or maybe who's going to work on this with students. At letter C recently, I've had some questions about the tempo there, because it goes all tempo, but that gesture is the same gesture that it was at the beginning of the piece. So I've had some people ask me questions and say, well, is it supposed to be slow like the beginning of the piece, or is the all tempo the playful 132? I like it as the playful 132 because we're in a different section, but we're reminiscing about an older section, or the first section. So that's just something I think is important in this. It's that it's the transition of ideas that runs through this. So, but I like this section because of the rhythmic gesture, but we do throw back to the opening. So we're kind of playing with both, but in a faster, push and pull kind of way.
Great. Yeah, I love this, the contrast in this movement. Jackie, do you want to say anything about the beginning, or should we just play it and listen to a larger chunk?
Maybe we should hear a little bit of the beginning and then we could talk about that.
Awesome. I just want to say it's like a vibrato class here. I love it. I think
You're very kind. Yeah, so for me, this movement is kind of the biggest stretch. It's definitely attainable. I think it's definitely an appropriate assignment for this age group, but this is the movement for me that benefits the most from really taking chances, pushing and pulling. Even listening to that, I'm like, you kind of hurried through that. Take a little, I think it really is the most convincing when you're really applying taking chances, stretching, moving through things, and having a real musical conviction that you're trying to portray. I think this movement really needs that. So having them benefit from the experience of the previous two movements. There's the most tenor clef in this movement, and it's frequently shifting in between. We have some tricky downward slurs, like it might be written G sharp, D sharp, but basically the A flat, E flat, A, E natural slur that's kind of tricky, that's good. They can't fake it, right? So they have to figure that out at this point in this movement. Even looking at that opening gesture, if we could see that real quick, it spans a very large range. They have to be able to execute going across the octave and having control of that type of thing. And I've had students where these two opening movements are kind of the most tricky, and going from that half hold G to D and making sure that the air and the embouchure is set up and not shifting, that they're not, basically bringing bad habits into those measures. But one thing that's really pedagogically beneficial, could we bring up the excerpt with the high D?
good. And I hate to say it, but we have about 30 seconds of time left. So go ahead.
So if we just look at the approach into measure 38, approaching that high D, it's really pattern based, and it's really building on this kind of stepwise pattern motion, which I think is a great pedagogical way to approach the high D, especially for a younger student who's kind of nervous. And then once they have it set, they can just keep it there after the fermata and they're set, and they're not going to be grasping. It's a really idiomatic, beautiful approach to something that might be new and scary. So those are kind of my thoughts.
This is wonderful. And we did get one question for Jenni actually about the second movement. Ara wants to know, she says at letter C, you say crispy with flashes of, or sorry, not crispy.
Maybe crispy. Delicious.
I got dinner on the brain. Crisp with flashes of gold. I think she was curious what you were intending there. You got 20 seconds.
Okay. I think what I was intending was sort of this forward motion of like, I think a little bit of the syncopation in there too gives a little bit of this like flash, these da dum bum 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 da 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 dum, it gets a little like flashes, and then we're off and going, and then a little flash in there again. So just some color, some sparkle in there is kind of how I was feeling of these different ideas being playing against each other. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, we need to move on to, and I just remembered that I forgot to even mention our wonderful sponsor for this session, which is Imagine Music, who is actually the publisher of Colored Stones. So thank you to them. We're gonna have a little presentation from them, but I believe that Jenni Brandon will be joining us after for the happy hour. And if you have questions for her, please bring them to the happy hour. And without further ado, thank you both for such wonderful information, and it was great to talk to you.
Thank you for inviting me. This was really fun.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you. So now for a word from our sponsor. I've always wanted to say that. And then we'll be back with the amazing Garrett McQueen, Executive Director of Triloquy, and Titus Underwood, Principal Oboist of the Nashville Symphony, to talk about William Grant Still's 3 songs. So stick around. Same bat channel, same bat place.
Since 2005, Imagine Music Publishing has been dedicated to creating, developing, and promoting music of the highest quality. Whether you're looking for some band, orchestra, or choir music for your ensemble, or if you need a solo or chamber work, Imagine Music has you covered. Imagine Music is a champion of new music and living composers. We are proud to represent such composers as Jenni Brandon, Daniel Baldwin, Paul Hansen, Karl Hovater, and David Huber. But we also offer a wide variety of works by Beethoven, Mozart, Mahler, and other composer greats. Imagine Music publishes more than 200 composers with nearly 5,000 titles in our catalog. And we are now proud to offer the complete Prairie Dog Press and Mountain Lion Press catalogs, originally created by the late Bruce Gabbard. All of our music is available as a stunning, high-quality print, or can be instantly downloaded as an e-print. If you haven't visited Imagine Music Publishing before, please check us out and see what we have to offer. And if you shopped with us before, come on back and see what is new. New titles are always being added to the catalog. Join the imagination. ImagineMusicPublishing.com.
And we're back. Thank you to Imagine Music again for sponsoring this. And listen to that Maverick fanfare by Daniel Baldwin in the background there. All right, so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mr. Garrett McQueen and Mr. Titus Underwood. Garrett McQueen is Executive Director, co-host, co-founder of the Triloquy podcast, which if you haven't listened to it, it's incredible. It's like everything entertainment and thought-provoking discussion and more information than I can even hold in my brain. And Titus from the Nashville Symphony, and we're going to talk about William Grant Still's 3 songs. So welcome to you both. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Awesome. So I'm pulling up my questions right now. Sorry, I was so captivated by the commercial. So my first question, which I have for both of you, is do you remember the first time you performed or you heard this piece? What do you remember about it, about that first time when you either played it or heard it performed?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. So I happened to be I happened to grow up in the city of Memphis, where a man named Lacolian Washington happened to be teaching bassoon when I was about 18 years old. So I had never taken bassoon lessons, and that really wasn't a part of my background. So, meeting Lacolian and having him as my first teacher is something that I feel like I have to mention as we're going to be hearing some of his recordings of these pieces. And, I mentioned, being from Memphis and happening to study with Lacolian because there were so many norms that I had created for myself that I didn't understand weren't norms across the board. I grew up in a mostly Black city. Of course, my bassoon teacher is going to be Black at the university. Of course, my Black bassoon teacher is going to record this incredible CD of all of this Black bassoon music. All of that seemed completely par for the course for me. Well, the deeper Lacolian got into this project, the more I understood that this is music that really has to be fought for, music that we really have to put on a platform across classical music, not even just specific to the bassoon. We've spent so much time creating value around how high we can play and how fast our fingers can move. And I think that goes all the way into the line of work I'm in now when we talk about audio production and recording. So my introduction to this piece came from Lacolian after he recorded it and sort of shared with me some of the struggles and some of the triumphs. It became one of those pieces that I have in my back pocket, starting from my senior recital as an undergraduate. I've never not played these sets of songs on a recital, because I think we take for granted sometimes that this music by this most important of Black composers, is here, and still so many of us don't know about it. So, my initial relationship with this piece of music was one of realization for me, and turned into a relationship of duty. I really love what this piece can do. We'll get into more of this, but I really love what this piece can do as far as the musician, not only the instrumentalist, but the musician. And I love that it's a piece of music that all of us who play woodwind instruments can really dive into, not necessarily as one that is that's going to deepen the pedagogy on our instruments, but one that gives us a closer proximity to American history, American music history, as it applies to conversations surrounding race and Black people's foundational relationship with American music. My very long way of saying that, I feel like to an extent I was on the ground level of the recording of this, at least had some proximity. And I'm really honored and moved to see how this piece has grown, and to see more and more people playing it, to see kids bringing it into master classes. It's not always about how fast can we play the chanson, second movement, right? Sometimes it's about how beautifully we can play. And I think it's great that we have an opportunity to do that while practicing racial equity in the arts.
Wonderful. That's very amazing that you got to work with Lacolian, and as he's, the first person to have recorded this bassoon version. Great. Titus, how about you?
Awesome. I mean, Garrett just knocked it out the ballpark. I mean, you can only have one preacher in the pulpit. But I'm thinking, now I was just thinking that, yes, the first time I came in contact with this piece was listening to Lacolian's recordings, actually. It's kind of amazing how that happens. And Lacolian's a dear friend of mine and great thinker and forward-pushing person of the culture. And when I first saw that, it really opened my mind up to what was available for me to play. Because I've played it with Laura Downs in the Rising Sun project. We'll be doing the other two as well, and there's some other pieces by Black composers. But one of the great things that Garrett talks about is we even though musical athleticism is a part of the craft and what we do, the technique, the scales, the thirds, the fourths, the fifths, all this stuff, these studies that we do, which is great, and I do them every single day to keep my chops up. But there is also a very unique space when I talk about Black American music, talking about William Grant Still. The thing that really resonates with me with that it really deepens the conversation, because you have to have a conversation about the context of its existence. You have to talk about how William Grant Still was creating music during Jim Crow. You cannot talk about William Grant Still without talking about Jim Crow. You can't talk about William William Grant Still's story and how to properly interpret his music and put that thought inside of it, because his family left Mississippi to Arkansas because his dad's friends were lynched for trying to be paid equally as teachers. So these are things that we have to talk about when we're approaching this music, because I always say when someone tells me to play something about Shostakovich, they talk to me about Stalin. They have to talk to me about that regime. They talk about that, what was going on, whether someone's good or bad. You have to be able to approach the music and know the proper context of how to interpret it. And I think a lot of times, especially with the still and with his songs, it may be simple, but there's a story behind that simplicity which takes it deeper into the interpretation that goes into it. And I think another thing to think about, why we sometimes these pieces, like Gary said, with the champion these pieces, what do you think about these pieces were created during the second Viennese School? You know, this was serialism. This is all this very hyper, and not saying that there isn't a place for all these types of music, but that was deemed as higher forms of music. If you were something that's melodic, even within the conservatory realm, many composers were shunned for writing something. You know, if you think about Copland, a lot of his first pieces were serialists. I mean, check out his piano variations. That is a 12-tone piece. It's a great piece. It sounds like Copland. But then he said, I want to write music for the people. For someone to say, I want to write music for the people, meaning he had to be in opposition of something else that was pushing him to write a different way. So William Grant Still and all these songs that he wrote was him taking the organic material that was made here right in this land that had not been written yet. And I think that is a part of the outward-facing culture that we should embrace as musicians in general, but especially to this American story that's here. The Black American story is so integral part, especially of our music history and classical music.
Yeah, I mean, I could listen to you guys talk about this piece for forever, but we do have some actual excerpts from Lekolian's CD, and then we're gonna, kind of dive into this music. So are we ready for that? Are we?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do it.
So we go. All right.
But before we do that, I just wanted to quickly say, Titus, when you talk about this material that was born here, I think that's a very important point to make. Well, I'm going to use, if we have time, I'm going to talk a little bit later about the word autochthonous. Okay, so we know that William Grant Still subtitled all four of his symphonies. Mm-hmm. You're talking about an autochthonous bit of material, but we'll get to that in a bit. But I just wanted to highlight that point because it's a very important point to understand when you approach this piece of music and music like it.
Wonderful. So we are going to look at the pieces in the order that Lekolian recorded them. And I'm just wondering, Garrett, do you know why he chose this order, or was it the way they spoke to him, or?
Yeah, among the many, many incredible things that I learned from Lekolian when I had the honor of studying with him was sequencing. He really paid a lot of attention to how we were thinking when it came to how to program recitals, what order to put things in. I apply much of that to the way I program, radio and that sort of thing these days. So I think his approach was to make sure that you ended with Bayou Home, because, if you've lived down south, the end of that piece sounds like the end of the story. It sounds like it's just a cultural, natural thing. I think the order of Song for the Lonely, If You Should Go, and then Bayou Home is the order that many of us have chosen based on the decision he made in recording it in that way. So with that in mind, I'll speak a little bit to the first movement, which is the Song of the Lonely. I'm looking at the score right here. One of the reasons I think this song is not only important historically and timely, not only for DEI purposes, but let's think about COVID. I've spent a lot of time in my work really trying to connect the experience of solidarity, the experience of being at home alone with music and what that means. With this song being titled Song for the Lonely, I think it's a really great opportunity to teach kids or inspire in adults who are working in this to really tap into that emotion. I think we know as bassoonists and as musicians how to tap into many of the basic feelings or colors. I feel like really getting to what a feeling of loneliness is a great exercise for the mind, and one that I think can come out through the instrument quite beautifully. Of course, we can talk about down slurs and how all of that stuff is a part of playing the bassoon. But again, I think the bigger point in this piece of music and learning this piece of music is really tapping into that culture, tapping into those feelings and connecting to it the best way you can. Of course, Titus and I have diasporic connections to this sort of music, but even for the musician who is not Black and wants to connect it to modern day, thinking about how lonely those beginning days of quarantine were, I think is a great inspiration. And again, a great way to inspire in a student the connection between feeling, experience, and playing the bassoon. So maybe we can hear a little bit of the opening of that movement. A recurring theme in this piece, as we heard at the end there, the way the entire suite ends, we have those open Fs that we love to decrescendo on as bassoonists, right? So, to maybe to get into the nitty gritty, that's something that I've really enjoyed teaching when it comes to this piece of music. My trick is to use that middle finger on the left hand and just slowly shade that tone hold to get that nice decrescendo on the open F. But Titus, I wanted to, throw it to you. As far as what I was talking about, that feeling, what are your thoughts of, approaching this as an example of not just stepping up to a piece of music and blowing into your horn, but really having to be prepared on the emotional side before you get into it?
Absolutely. I think this is something that there's an issue that happens with programming. This may take a slight difference, but it's relatable. There's a problem that comes in when we talk about programming today. We check all the boxes, right, without the context. We say we're putting this many Black composers on there, we're putting this many Latinx composers on there, putting this many women on there, and there isn't a deeper reason for the story. I went to conservatory for 4 to 6, I mean, if I'm counting a lot of school, probably like 9 years between going from Cleveland Institute of Music to Juilliard to Coburn. I love all my teachers, amazing mentors, all this stuff. But I went to the institutions to really teach me how to play Bach, to really teach me how to play Mozart. Someone's like, you got to really think about the powdered wig and this, that, and the other. And, they create all this imagery for you to properly approach the music as it should be approached properly. It absolutely should. The same goes for any other composer. The same goes for the context of this music. So for one to truly understand, I think where the friction comes in for a Steele or a Bonds or a Florence Price is that there is a story that creates a dissonance to the existence of what structures we're playing in. So the more that music is unmined, the more the story's told, the more there has to be a reckoning, the more there has to be repair. So this is when I'm approaching this music, I need to truly understand what was the making of this music. Like many people don't know William Grant Still's story. They know his Afro-American Symphony, and that's about it that they put on the MLK concert with one rehearsal and then played it and then went about their day. It's not given the proper time or the proper nuance. No one tells you, no, that's not the right nuance. No, maybe you should use different finger for this. No, do you know when this was written? Do you understand when this was written? We go through all this grueling process to play all this other music. And that's why I'm very, very specific about this is I'm very passionate about William Grant Still's story and then other Black composers' story. But I'm very passionate about Still's story because his story is an American story. And that's what shows. And the thing when we think about American music, we think of Henry Cowell, we think of Charles Ives, we think of Aaron Copland, we think of Bernstein, we think of Gershwin. Let's just take Gershwin, friends. Just that one little piece of Gershwin. Gershwin plays all these jazz chords, all this stuff, and people say, "Oh, he did. I'm gonna do something for Black artists. I'm gonna do Porgy and Bess." But no sound happens in a vacuum, and I want people to really think about this. Gershwin has the sound he gets has to be connected to a culture and a people. Where does that sound come from? Where did those people come from? How many years did it take to make that sound? What do those people look like? What is their culture? Who are they? Who are these Americans? Right? So it won't just be a one-off and say there's this guy and this guy who used some of these things, but where did those things that he used come from? What was the making of that? Still was very, very, very forward about that. And that's why a lot of his pieces, symphonies, had words to them, had poetry written to them, many of them written in Negro dialect. And this is why I'm kind of going on this bigger circle, because when you play a concerto by Mozart, someone may ask you, have you heard one of Mozart's operas? Have you listened to his operas? You need to listen to Mozart's operas so you can properly interpret Mozart, because you don't know Mozart until you've played his operas. So you don't know still, you understand, until you've really learned you've gone into his symphonies. You've learned that he's written operas. You know about his ballet. You understand this character, this person, his life. Then you can approach a song for the lonely for something that has a simple melody, and you can distill it into something so beautiful. And you can really feel it because you know the context of why he wrote it and how he wrote that, no matter how simple the melody is, because we give that tribute to every other composer. So that's the thing that's a really important point. I'm going to pass off to Garrett, see what he says about it. But that's a really important point that we have to keep in mind, that I love talking about that specific piece, but context matters on how I approach something even this simple.
And I actually think that's an incredible segue. And also, for the sake of time, I would love to bring up the example from William Grant Still's Africa. Sometimes we tend to, take this music, and as Titus was speaking to, lift it outside of context. Once we understand the context of William Grant Still's story, the context of early 20th century America, why this music existed, and why we're just now learning about it and giving attention to it, it opens the door to so many other things. There's a piece among William Grant Still's many pieces of music is a tone poem titled Africa. So in addition to having the charge of codifying this American sound and putting it into music, William Grant Still also felt like he had the responsibility to paint the picture of what is beyond, or what was before. We take for granted that in 1930, we couldn't go on the internet and look up a picture of Africa. The only images many Black people ever saw of Africa were pieces of music. And William Grant Still wrote one, a tone poem called Africa. This piece of music in particular, I think, is very relevant to this conversation because it also highlights William Grant Still's sort of understanding of the bassoon and the sounds it makes. In the opening bassoon solo in the second movement of this that we're about to hear, you're actually going to hear the bassoon in just about exactly the same range. It even starts on that same tenor F. So let's listen to a little bit of second movement of Africa by William Grant Still. And, once we uncover and continue to highlight works and little moments like that, it forces us to begin to ask, why isn't that on every single excerpt list? If we want to hear how quietly I can play Tannhäuser, or how well I can blend with the oboe in the Ravel, the Pavane for their Princess, I believe, that moment that we just heard should be on the audition stage, and there's a lot to work with there. I know we're running short on time. Titus, the one question I wanted to make sure that we covered here, one of the pre-questions was, what would we ask William Grant Still if he were still around? I mentioned the word autochthonous earlier. So William Grant Still has 4 symphonies, each with a subtitle: the Afro-American, the Song of a New Race, the Sunday Symphony, and the Autochthonous Symphony. Through that music, through those works, through these 3 songs, all of his entire repertoire, he's trying to make the point that these sounds that you are hearing are not only native, autochthonous to America, but they're Black. My question to him would be, how can we expand that idea of Black foundation of America even beyond music? That would be the question I would ask him if I had him on Triloquy or something like that. What about you, Titus?
I would ask William Grant Still, what do you think an American orchestra look like and sound like? What are the bases of sound that create the American sound? You know, so if we're thinking, I mean, people say, you know, Vienna has a sound, Berlin has a sound, you know, all these sounds. And there's nothing wrong with preserving, you know, many European cultures within America. We know America has many different immigrant cultures contribute to it, but something like we were talking about, the Song of a New Race, I talked to Gary about before. We're talking about a new amalgamated group of people in America called Black people in America. We have to really think about that process that created that. You know, these last names of McQueen or Underwood didn't come by mistake. You know, there was a process that got there. There was a culture that was preserved through that. There was music that was made through that. There was nuance. There was speech. There's swag. There's cool. There's so much that's come through that. So I would ask William Grant Still, what does that look? What is the outward-facing culture of an American orchestra? What does a conservatory look like, and what should be taught there? What are the etudes built off of some of these melodies and nuances and idioms that you want us to learn from 5 years old up? What do we value here that we can take somewhere else instead of just preserving something that is from a distant land that many of us haven't lived in? I mean, we're preserving Brahms, but how many of you live where he's from? How many of you lived in Vienna where Mozart? How many of you actually lived there in Austria? How many of you lived there? So, you know, but you do know this American sound. That's very close to you. You grew up around it. Sounds all around you. Why isn't that valued within our conservatories, with our acoustic voices? That's what we're asking. How would you redo that? And then what would that canon look like? Because that would add value to the global musical community. So those are the things I would love to pick his brain on, because he was very specific about how he titled things and wrote things in the poetry about it. He was very specific, not always explicit with his own words, but very explicit in his words. So that's what I would ask him.
If I can tie a bow on it all, you know, if there's anything that anyone has heard, remember this. The very first time I heard this performed on a masterclass, and I was giving the masterclass, it was the first time that I had to think about, I don't have to teach technique here. I don't have to teach flicking and those sorts of things. The weakness here is the music. If anyone, you know, is a nerd about the Matrix like I am, you know, there's a point where Morpheus tells Neo that his weakness is not his technique, okay? I think this is a great example of a piece of music that really forces us to dig into those feelings, dig into that real musicianship, and to actually create a melody and to sing a melody. I think it's important that these are named songs. We definitely should think of them as songs. And for all of the teachers, getting their students to approach this no matter what instrument, I would really encourage you to keep that in mind, encouraging your students to sing a song through their instrument and to understand where this song comes from, why this is, and why it's important to understand these things within the framework of music, and most broadly within the framework of what is America, what is foundational to America, and how can we highlight that and share that history.
You guys are awesome. Thank you so much. We have, you know, 1 or 2 minutes. You already tied a bow on it though. So I'm going to open it up for Q&A so people can put their questions in the chat. This has been such a wonderful half an hour to discuss this piece with you. And I think we came into it thinking it would be about pedagogy of like how to play the bassoon, but really it's pedagogy of how to study the piece, right? Like it's about not just picking up the bassoon and blowing air. It's about understanding where it came from. And thank you both for that. As a teacher, very, very enlightening. If you don't mind sticking around for 1 and 2 minutes for questions, I don't know if you might need to go, but you're good. I kind of wanted to throw Titus's question back at him and ask him what his orchestra would look like, because I've listened to you talk and I know your musical background is all kinds of things. What would you put? What sound would you go for?
That's a great question.
It's yours.
Yes, it is my question. trying to put my secrets out. No, I'm just kidding. But I think one thing is about it's an ideological switch that has to happen for the sound to be there. I've not heard it yet. I'll tell you that. I've not necessarily heard it. That's not saying that I appreciate the Philadelphia sound, the Cleveland sound. I come from that. I was Cleveland Institute of Music, all that sound, the extension that was in Juilliard, all my teachers there. Loved it. Amazing. Value it. If I were to have an American orchestra, American sound, it would truly, really value Black American music. I think it's very hard for people to stick on that because they think of it just primarily just the racial lens. Which, of course, how could you not? Because America created the racial caste system, which there was Jim Crow. And I tell people this, really think about this. Beethoven's Ninth, written in the mid 1800s, right? The same time, at that very same time, a song that was very popular at the time was Jim Crow. The minstrel song that created a law that lasted 100 years was being at its peak at the same time Beethoven's Ninth was being written. That's mind blowing for people to think about. So I tell people, drop a timeline and say, Beethoven's third, 1806, I think it is, 1803. What's simultaneously happening right then in America? So then I have a context of what's the music that's happening in America from the struggle that's happening in America for people creating this American sound. Then you start to create, then people learn about, they know how to properly interpret the music, know where the Negro songs come from and spirituals and the nuance of it and the expressivity of it and the melismas that go within gospel music and that goes into jazz and all these other things in blues. We will learn how to improv better because improvisation is very much a preserved art of the classical art of jazz is made here in America. We would know how to improv. We would know how to take the stage with a solo. We would know how to cheer someone on to play another cadenza. These things will be in the culture. There'd be a more call or response that's there, more interactive thing than me sitting here, a glass Strauss, and I can't wait to cough in between the movements. Mm-hmm. There'd be something that's different that's there, which creates a different sound, a different energy, a different charisma that's there. And you will have more musicians who have more skill sets that's based in many traditions that are rich right here in this land. But they have to preserve and think that that's valuable. And also one has to be comfortable with where the music came from, those people who created that music. So there's a multi-layered story. That's the bridge that turns into an orchestra that's more outward that is projecting culture out to the world that other people want to learn from, rather than let's just preserve this, which is cool. I'm not saying absent of that, but are we American orchestras or we're a European approximate? Which one are we?
We have to really consider when you talk about those reverberations, those residual effects, what that could really mean. Let's go with a William Grant Still example, the Afro-American Symphony. It starts with that English horn solo, which of course evokes the work songs from way back then. Quickly getting into something a little jazzy. Okay, so we are 8, maybe 16 bars into this piece of music, and there is an entire history for us to study. If every orchestra took this American piece of music and made it as standard as a Brahms symphony or as standard as a Beethoven symphony, the conservatories would have to teach these things because you have to be prepared for that if you get into an orchestra and play this American music. I feel like audiences would have to understand these things if this American sound were more foundational to what orchestras look like today. Anything that we consider jazzy, anything that we consider bluesy would be my picture of what an American orchestra would be. Not to say that there wouldn't be a Black piece of music like the Dvorak every now and again. We can have that conversation later, but the focus would be what we have not always focused on. That's the definition of equity, and for me, that's what it would look like.
I want to add one last thing to what Garrett wanted to say, at like 30 seconds or something.
Okay, we do have a question. We do have a question in the Q&A too. So
great. One thing I want to add to people, something I think about a lot. Orchestra halls were built with certain repertoire in mind, which means that sometimes if you put something in there, say for instance, in lots of Black American music that's more basic, percussive, things like that, the hall can't take it because it's not built to make that sound at its forte. It's meant to play a Beethoven, a Mozart, a Mahler is even pushing the hall sometimes. So if you're really thinking about how we would create the acoustic space, which makes it unique to not be just copying something. Oh, this hall is just like the hall here in Vienna. That shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be, how do we build something around the sounds that we create, which even influences the way we make the instruments we play, the pedagogical ways that we approach things. This we're just at the tip of the iceberg of how far we can go to actually add more cultural value in preserving acoustic music. The reason why things are always a sinking Titanic, because maybe there's a disconnect between the culture that's here and the people who want to listen to it.
The question in the chat speaks to recommended resources to learn more about Black American music, and where did our knowledge about this music come from if it wasn't from the conservatory. I'll start with the second question. Anybody who grew up in the Black church understands what a Negro spiritual is, and understanding what a Negro spiritual is understanding the first music, with the exception of the indigenous people, that was really created here, that was autochthonous, again, that word, to the United States. So the concept of Black music and its evolutions is one that I'm just familiar with culturally, and I think many Black folks are familiar with culturally. Concerning recommended resources, I try to throw out as many different things every time I do these talks. When people ask that question, the recommendation I'll give today, since we're talking about songs, is to look up the name Henry Thacker Burleigh, or Harry Thacker Burleigh. It's because of him that the Negro spirit, well, him and many others, but that the Negro spiritual transitioned into legit music, or music written down on paper. So understanding his legacy, I think, is a great starting point, because from there you can see some of those evolutions, and even some of those moments that have proximity to Western classical music. Henry Thacker Burleigh is the person with whom Dvorak talked and got ideas for his American chamber music, those quartets and quintets, and of course the Ninth Symphony. So Henry Thacker Burleigh, or sometimes you'll see Harry Thacker Burleigh. I would encourage everyone to start there. Wonderful.
Thank you both so much. We have to let you go because we've gone way past our time, but we will have our happy hour Zoom. The link is in the chat. And just once again, thank you both, Titus and Garrett. It's been a pleasure listening to you talk for 30 plus minutes. And everyone go check out there are other resources online to listen to them speak more to these issues of classical music. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming. We'll see you in the Zoom happy hour.